Brim. This is one of the most exciting parts of hat making because this is when you get to see what your finished hat is going to look like. What you get to do is the lining first, and this is a great way of practicing for your fashion fabric side of the hat. Now, most of the hats are done pretty much the same way. This one's fire cake, and what your objective is to get a smooth line here where the brim and the hat crown meet. There's one exception to that though, this one. This is smash. Now with smash we actually want a little bit of gathering or tucks right there where the brim and the hat crown meet. So I'll tell you about the little adjustments that you make for smash as we go along. The only other thing is, if you've decided to add some interfacing to your crown to make it a little bit firmer, then you need to watch the video adding structure, because that will tell you a few more tips and tricks to get a really great finish in that case. Okay, now let's get started on our hat crown. Now this is the lining, and I'll just show you the brim. This is the brim. What I'm going to do is have the lining matching the brim like this. So that hat crown lining will go on the brim like that. First thing we do is pull up this stay stitching that you've done on the bottom edge of the side. Now, if your threads are on the wrong side, just get a pin and flick them through. Get one of the ends, pull it up, and actually gather that all the way around. Spread your gathers along. What this does is take a little bit of fullness out of the bottom edge, because when you start stitching, the machine tries to stretch it. So we're compensating for that. So make sure you've got your gathers spread all around, and then actually push them out again, but don't push them out all the way, which means you've retained a little bit of fullness, or shrinking of that fullness away. Right, now I'll get my machine. Now I take off my drawer, so I've got a free arm. If you don't have a free arm, you'll be able to do it anyway. Now I've got my brim lining side up, this way round. This is the seam of the side facing up. Remember, it's your lining. Now align the side seam of the side with the seam at the back of the brim, and then look at your brim guideline. Place the edge of the side right on that guideline, or a smidgen that way, away from or closer to the raw edge. Now you move your needle, if you can, close to the edge, so you'll be stitching along the edge of the side. Stitch length you should based on first, so lengthen your stitch length. If you're feeling confident, you can stitch it on regular stitch length first, because unless you're making a reversible hat, a few little mistakes and nicks and tucks and so on won't matter. But I'm going to base mine to begin with. Now we use feel for doing this, and sight. We're feeling the edge of this and the edge of the brim at the same time and stitching on. Now ideally we stitch right on top of that guideline, or a smidgen inside the seam allowance. That way this line of stitching won't be seen on the outside of the hat. Now because it's the lining, doesn't matter if you get a few little gathers, but you don't want it really gathered because you might not have enough fabric once you get all the way around. Now, I'm probably 2/3 of the way around. I can start to feel whether or not my hat crown is going to fit over that brim. Now, it's feeling a little bit tight. So what I'm going to do, just lift up, press a foot, stretch out my gathers, push them away. If on the other hand it was feeling really loose and as if this was going to be too big, I'd pull up those gathers a bit by grabbing my thread down here and giving it a yank. A gentle yank. Now if you were doing smash, your lining and your fashion fabric outside of the hat would be much bigger than the brim. That is fine because that's what we want. We want to bring gathers into it. So you will be stitching your gathers in. Now as you can see, it looks like it's going to fit quite nicely. Now as I said before, if this hat crown looked too big, I'd grab this thread and pull that up and take away some fullness. If it was looking too small, I'd stretch that out, get rid of all those gathers I possibly could. I'd even, if I had to, snip this guideline on both sides, and that would allow you to stretch the hat crown lining a bit. Now having fit that really well, I could keep on going in my regular stitch length and finish that off. Or if I was lazy, I'd just leave it as it is. I'm just going to finish off today so we can move on to the next step. Right, so that gives you an idea of what the hat's going to look like, except that this is the lining side. Next job is to move on to the other side and put on our fashion fabric outside of the hat. Right, this is my hat crown, my fashion fabric that I'm going to be putting on this fire cake hat. Now, I've interfaced this very lightly with armour weft. So this technique I'm going to show you now works really well if you have no interfacing or light interfacing. If you've used a stiffer interfacing, you probably need to go and look at my other video on adding structure. Now, it's basically the same thing as before. We have to pull up our threads. I forgot to pull out my thread before and get it ready. All we do is pull out your thread. Now, if you have interfaced, sometimes it makes it a little bit harder to pull up this thread and add a little bit of gathering. And if you have got really stiff interfacing, you just won't be able to do this, and that's why you do need to look at that other video. But if you have a little bit of interfacing, you still got to get a little bit of gather in there, but ultimately no gathers will be seen. So I'm going to pull it from both ends because I don't want to actually pull my thread out. So there we are. Now spread those gathers out again, retaining a little bit of fullness but not enough so that any gathers will be seen, because this is our outside of our hat and we've got to get our finish perfect. So, brim goes on again the same way as before. Hat crown goes on again like before, matching the seams. Now, one of the other tricks is, because you've already got that lining there, you don't want to get it all bunched up under there and accidentally stitch it in, and I have done that a number of times. It's really annoying. So keep that puffed out there like that. Put your brim, your crown over the top, and as you stitch you're going to have to stop constantly and push that lining away so that you don't stitch it. Now you will be basting this time. Don't try and do your final stitching now. Make sure my lining is pushed out of the way. Again, we're going to be stitching along the edge, and we're, as I said, using a basting stitch length. Now, this time we're going to stitch either on our guideline or more towards the brim, a little bit on the brim, not in the seam allowance. If we stitched across the seam allowance, you would end up seeing that guideline. So I just hold it just slightly over the guideline, and as I said, I stop every so often and make sure my lining is out of the way. Now, because you've got a little bit of puffiness in that side, sometimes you lift your presser foot and sort of move the puffiness towards the back. Now, of course, if you're doing smash, you actually want all these gathers, and all you do is you gather it up, make it fit the brim, and spread those gathers evenly along the length of the side, and then stitch the hat crown on. You don't need to do anything to try and disguise them. They're meant to be there. Now, this section here, I've got quite a few gathers there. I don't want to see them. I'm going to move them along. Still want fullness, but no gathers. Now, if you're making a reversible hat, you actually have to be as careful as this on the lining side as well. Now, I'm starting to have a look to see whether my hat crown is likely to fit my brim, and it's looking like it's too small. That just means I've got too many gathers in, so I'm making sure I push them out. Now, it's a good idea, if you've got a needle up-down, automatic up-down button, to set it so that you're always finished with the needle down while you're doing this. Just makes it stay in place if you have to lift the presser foot. Now I'm going to have to pull out more gathers all the way, I think. Now, if it looked like I had the reverse problem, that this hat crown was going to be far too big, I would be thinking about stitching further onto the brim. That would make my circumference much bigger, and only moving your stitching 1 millimetre will make a huge difference. So if you do need to do that, only move it 1 millimetre. That's a tiny smidgen if you're on the inches system. That's like 1/3 of an 1/8 of an inch. Now, I think I say in my instructions 5 to 8 centimetres before the end, check how you're going. Now, I'm a bit further than that. I'm probably 12 centimetres from the end. It's sort of like 4 inches. This is the time when you really have a look to see how you're going, whether it's going to fit. And I think mine will, But all those things I said before, what you can consider doing now if you're not fitting properly. If you've got a really bad fit, if this seems far too big, for example, I'd just stop right now, unpick it all and re-stitch 1mm onto the brim. If this was far too small, what I would be doing is adjusting all that gathering you had put in. In other words, you probably pulled it up too much. You need to spread out that gathering. Now here it is, I'm coming to the end, it's looking pretty good. Since I'm using the same colour thread that I would use for my final stitching, I could just keep on going. If I'd used a different colour for my basting, I'd stop and then go over again with my final regular stitch length. I'm just going to stop there now, so you've got the idea. Pull that out. Snip off my threads. Now, because this is your finished hat, we want to make sure all our threads are gone from this side. Now, if you are not making a reversible hat and you don't mind seeing a bit of stitching, you don't need to pull out anything that you can see on the inside. I don't usually bother, but if that bothers you, pull out anything that you don't need there, like your stay stitching. And for most hats, that's it, all done. Smash, you do have to put your band on yet, but for most of the hats, that's it. Good luck with your hat making.